and thanks, as always, to the Maison Française and to Shani for making this evening possible. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our two speakers tonight to speak on what's really a growing and I think one of the most exciting fields in the humanities right now, which is the relations between cinema and philosophy. And how cinema in particular, through the work of our two speakers, how cinema, new media, visual culture in general are or forcing philosophy to reconsider some of its fundamental questions. So the format tonight will be our two speakers will speak, and then we'll open the floor to question and discussions. It's a little self-evident, but so our two speakers, Elie During is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Université of Paris, Nanterre, Ouest-Nanterre. He also teaches at the École Nationale des Beaux-Arts. He's a former student of the École Normale Supérieure and of Princeton University, and he served for a while as the head of the book section of the French Cultural Services here in New York. He's an author of several books, one of which is author and editor of the book Matrix, Machine, Philosophie, which came out in 2003, I guess, and which was fairly controversial, but it's an extremely smart book on a complex commercial film. Matrix, Machine, Philosophie, for one of the editors and one of the authors. He is also the editor of a volume of the journal Critique, which came out in 2005 on cinema and philosophy, which is a great volume of Critique. 2005, I think it is. Yes. With an article by Alain Badiou on cinema as a democratic emblem, which we just read, an interview with Jacques, Rancière, and a series of really interesting essays. He is also primarily, but not only, a Bergson scholar, and so knows Bergson and cinema, knows Bergson's legacy with cinema very well, and recently edited a critical edition of Durée et Simultanéité, and is publishing a book on Bergson, the Bergson-Einstein controversy, which is coming out this year, or maybe out in April. Great. Our second speaker, Patrice Maniglier, is a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Essex, and is also taught at Lille and at l'École Normale Supérieure. He is also a graduate of the École Normale Supérieure. He wrote his dissertation under the supervision of Etienne Balibar, who's just here. He's the author of a number of books on the intersection between philosophy and social sciences, including a book on Saussure and a book on Lévi-Strauss, the vocabulaire de Lévi-Strauss. Patrice also contributed to the Matrix volume. And he has just published this book, which I'm just delighted to have in my hand, Foucault va au cinéma, which has just come out with Badiou. And I also want to mention, before turning things over, two books that our two guests just published in the collection with Actes Sud, which seems to be a great collection. These are two absolutely fantastic books, which I had the great pleasure of reading. One is Faux Raccord, La coexistence des images by Elie During, on the coexistence of images in the form of split screens, in the form of montage, temporal disjunctions, and also our coexistence with images, Faux Raccord, which is an absolutely fantastic book. And then Patrice Maniglier published La perspective du diable, the devil's perspective, or the devil's point of view, which I just love the title, and the book as well, which is a way to rethink the relation between thought and image, not necessarily from Satan's point of view, although that comes in, but also focusing on an art installation by two French artists who recreated the apartment of Rosemary and Guy Woodhouse in Rosemary's Baby. And the installation was called Rosemary's Place, and this is the starting point of Patrice's amazing reflection on perspective, on time, on philosophy, and cinema, or visual culture. So welcome, and thank you, Patrice Maniglier and Elie During.
Thank you very much. I am actually the first speaker today. So I'm going to present you something on well, on the book, which Bill mentioned. So I just want to thank the Maison Française and you guys in particular for inviting us here today. We are delighted to be here, and I hope it will be a shared pleasure. And well, I just want to say sorry for my accent. I don't know whether it's French or British, but it's a mixture, it's really not American, and it's probably sometimes hard to understand, but I hope that it will work. Okay, so I still say that there's been a lot of philosophical interest in movies lately, but too often I think philosophers tend to relate to films just as mere illustrations of already given philosophical ideas. So you could find in The Matrix exactly Plato's cave, or you could find in Hitchcock everything you always wanted to know about Lacan, as the irreplaceable Slavoj Žižek once said. Well, this is a bit unsatisfying to us, and in fact our question, Elie and I, we share that, we share many things, but also this methodological approach. Our question is very simple. Is it possible to do better than that? That is to find in films things which theory or philosophy has not already offered. So our answer, unsurprisingly, is yes. And I hope we will be convincing in supporting this answer. So one way to do that would be to start with problems, and that's what the way we suggest we work. Don't tell anybody, but it's a Deleuzian methodology. That's exactly what it is. So we think that we need to start with problems, with philosophical problems, and then we think that you can find in different practices, non-philosophical practices, visual practices, for instance, problems which are analogical in some way, but different treatments of the same problem. Okay, and so our question is whether if we pay attention, close attention to the way the problem is treated, for instance, in cinema, we could re-elaborate and maybe displace the philosophical problems which we have inherited from the past. Okay, so that's the way we work, and that's why I think we are here, just maybe to give an example of what we do. So more recently, I published this book, which Phil mentioned, with a colleague of mine, Dr. Zabunian, where we try to approach the relation between Foucault and cinema. So why Foucault? Well, because precisely Foucault didn't like cinema. That's the great thing with Foucault, that he had absolutely no interest in cinema. He was interested in literature, in painting, in music. I mean, he had a lot of various interests, but cinema was not among them. In fact, he was approached by film critiques, in particular from the Cahiers du Cinéma. And if he replied to these people asking him interviews, it's also because he had the impression that they had concerns in their own field which resonated with his own problems as a historian and as a philosopher. So basically, one of these main questions was with the possibility of having a non-ideological relation to history. History is very often a way by which we hyper-ideologically relate to our own self. Because it's guided by the question, how did we become who we are now? And Foucault opposes to this question a radical shift in the approach to history. That's what he does in his philosophical and historical practice. He says that we should do history or turn to the past not in order to have a more accurate view of what is no more, and not also in order to explain the present, but on the contrary, in order to get a stronger sense of the contingency of our own situation. So not to explain why we have become what we are now, not to find a necessity behind all that, but on the contrary, to find a better sense of things that could be different, and therefore maybe could be changed. So history is for Foucault an instrument to estrange ourselves. I love this word in English. In particular because it relates to alliance, to matrimonial alliance. It's great to be married with someone, but estranged, that's a beautiful thing. So you have to have this kind of relation to yourself. Anyway. So what he meant by that is that he wanted us to have a sense of the contingency of what we take for granted. So all the absolute things which we think are unavoidable should be reworked and appear as merely contingent. So for instance, we think that everybody has always had a sexuality, and that sexuality is a dimension of the human life. Therefore, the job of someone who do the history of sexuality would simply be to tell us what the sexual behaviors in the past have been, and what the conception maybe about sex have been in the past. But Foucault disapproves of this approach to the history of sexuality, and for him, to do the history of sexuality consists in showing that the very notion of sexuality, the very problem of sexuality, is nothing necessary or absolute. So it's not that sexuality has changed, right? It's that we must define sexuality by a series of changes which constitute it as a problem, as an object. So that means that the very notion of sexuality must become a variant. So just one possibility of something which could be otherwise, and must be defined in the field of other things which it could be, right? So for instance, it could be the Greeks' aphrodisia, or the Roman care of the self, or the Christian pastoral techniques. I mean, these different things would help to relate to ourselves in a differential way, to reduce our own present to all the differences which they present with these other forms of ourselves. So the beauty of that is that instead of looking at the past as a present, as a former present situation which is no more, he wants to look at the present as a pure variation, something which is already defined as a variation, right? So that's what I'm interested in. So not to define the present as something that changes, but to define the present as a variation in itself. So very often I think we can feel what it means. Basically, it means to have a very radical historical approach to everything, right? But we usually don't realize how radical this shift must be. And that's what I would like to emphasize now. It basically means that there is nothing underneath that changes. There is nothing underneath the changes that changes. It means that what we are, what there is, everywhere, would be nothing but changes. So the job of the historian would be to deconstruct the illusion of any sort of underlying identity, and to reduce everything to the sort of variation that it is. Right? So it's a critical work in the sense that it reduces everything to something else than what it appears to be. It reduces everything to things which are defined by correlation of differences. A variant, that's the way I call it. So it's a very anthropological relation to history, in the sense of what anthropologists do. They relate to others in order to redefine us as others among others, as Lévi-Strauss once said. Okay, if I'm saying things which don't make sense to you, right, make faces. Okay, now this idea, right, this idea that there is that there are changes, but nothing that changes underneath. This idea actually comes from Bergson. It's actually a sentence from Henri Bergson. And in fact, it's a very odd idea, right, which goes against our normal way of thinking. So what I'm saying here is that Foucault's practice of history commits him to a particular philosophical conception of the world, which sometimes he elaborates on, but not always. He doesn't feel the need to do it always, but he does. So, and this conception of the world basically says that the world is made of events, of happenings, of changes, and nothing else than that. Of course, you would probably recognize here also some claim made by Deleuze. If you have ever read Deleuze, you will know that Deleuze is someone who trying to construct philosophy which is based on this idea that there is nothing but events. But the interesting fact here is that also Deleuze, at one point of his life, felt the need to turn to cinema in order to understand better what an event is. And Deleuze's thesis on cinema is quite simple, basically, even though it's difficult to follow in the details. But the general idea is very simple. It says cinema is the art of extracting pure events, pure becomings, from current situations. So to reduce everything precisely to that, to change it, to become right. So that's an interesting fact for us, or an interesting idea, because it may mean that we can find in the way cinema has approached historical problems something which will indeed resonate with Foucault's historical practice. There is an encounter here, just an encounter. So, can we learn anything about the nature of historical events if we look at the way cinema has approached history? That's basically my general question in the book, right? So I'm just going to give you one example, which I think is very impressive, of the way cinema can help construing a certain concept of event, which we don't find already made in philosophy. It's, the example is Night and Fog by Alain. So I know it's not a very funny film, but it's not Alain's fault. It's not my fault. It's that history is sometimes very violent. So why this film? Well, precisely because it shares the same concerns as Foucault's. Why? Because precisely it's a documentary film on a historical event which aims at disturbing the relation between the past and the present, which organizes our notion of history. Oddly enough, in fact, and maybe that's not enough said, the film is not made in order to fight against forgetting or even forgiving. In fact, the film relates to the past not as something which has occurred in a different location in the line of time, but on the contrary as something which is an ever-present virtuality of our current situation. So basically it wants to disturb the relation between the present and the past, as if the past was just something far off in time, and say, well, no, you must relate to the past as a virtual dimension of your own present. It shows something about what you are, but as an effect also, it means that our present is nothing but precisely one virtual possibility of time, of a system which includes the past. Okay, so in fact, Resnais says it very clearly in an interview which he gave to Richard Resnais. Actually, I think it's not translated in English, but it's there. I haven't found it, so if anyone has a clue about that, it would be very helpful for me and my students. We will have to learn about that soon. So that's what he says. I had this idea of interrogation, question. Yes, that's what it is. I wanted a film which say to people, not, don't forget. I wasn't interested in that, but trying to understand why that happened. Or rather, don't wait for it to have happened, in order to care about it. I spoke often of, well, I don't know how to translate that in English actually, sonnette d'alarme, emergency alarm, emergency alarm. And it was the terror that it may start again. It was indeed a huge interrogation, a question mark. The science, who is accountable for that? So in other words, the point of this historical film is not to teach us anything about the past, but rather to make our present itself more problematic to our own eyes, to unsettle our relation to ourselves now. So the past destabilizes the relation that the present has to itself. Right? It's not that the past is something which must know, or which can be known, actually. So it's a strange reversal, actually, if you think about it, in the notion of historical knowledge. The past is not that which has to be known. It's us who are known or discovered by the past. So you have a very clear example of that in the final scene. Maybe if I have time, actually, I will screen some of these, where you have the room of the camp, and I think it's a block which is the gas chamber, but I'm not quite sure about that. And it said that it is a strange observatory, that we have to look at our time from this point. And in fact, it means that these images, which you will see in Night and Fog, are not meant to be seen for themselves. They are meant to displace the way we look. Right? They say, look around. Look on your sides. Don't look only on what there is here. In fact, Resnais had in mind the colonial war against the Algerian independence at that time. And he wanted to say, well, look, these things are around us. It's a virtuality of the present. Other people, suspected that it was about the camps in the Soviet Union, but actually it doesn't matter too much in the sense that the point is more general than that, I think, and we can still think about it and find examples here. So the point is that we communicate with the past, not as with a distant object, but with as with a possibility of ourselves, right? So I think you see how it resonates with what Foucault wants to say. It's a critical relation to the present, as opposed to an objective attempt at defining or showing the past. Now the question is, I'm just following my methodology, and the question would be, what are the cinematic techniques that Resnais uses in order to convey this intention? How does he do it himself? I know how Foucault does it, actually, but I don't know yet how Resnais works himself. And can we learn anything which may be of interest from a sort of, Deleuzean Foucauldian perspective from these techniques, from these cinematic techniques? Can we learn anything about the nature of historical knowledge if we look at this film very closely? I think there are three major techniques, or tricks, if you want, in this film, which convey this sense of the critical relation to our present through the past. So the first one consists in creating a tension between the text and the images. Basically, the text says you cannot have a good sense of what we show. Right? The text contradicts the images, and it conveys the impossibility of having a sense of what is in the past in a certain way. So instead of helping us to cross over the gulf of time, the film increases this gap, makes it even harder. Okay, there are many things to say about this. This is properly cinematic, right? It's audio-visual. There is a discrepancy, there is a contradiction between what is said and what is shown. Right? And this tension is very interesting. It's something which Foucault in the 70s was also very interested in. And of course, obviously, philosophy cannot do that because it doesn't have any visual. Well, it could. Traditionally doesn't use images to do it. Well, the second technique is the juxtaposition of images in black and white on the one hand from the archives, and images in colors which are shot on the spot in the camps. And the color, that's really very painful, because the color, instead of making these images more realistic, giving us a sense of the reality of these camps, in fact makes it even harder for us to represent what there is. In fact, they split the image, as if we couldn't relate to what they were presenting, precisely because they are in color. And there is a beautiful line in the text by Jean Quérol, where he says, so I'm going to say it first in French, and then actually because the translation, oddly enough, doesn't contain the word color. But, in French it is, de ce dortoir de briques, de ce sommeil menacé, nous ne pouvons que vous montrer l'écorce, la couleur. So of this brick dormitory, of these threatened sleepers, we can only show you the shell, and oddly enough, they say the shadow, it's the color. Right? So the color is precisely what separates us from the object. Right? It's not a better representation, but on the contrary, something even more difficult. An indication in a present image of the split which is open in the present itself. The fact that we cannot coincide with that has been the present. We are unsettled. We cannot really reconcile with this present. And the third technique are these very famous panoramic shots, which, in particular at the beginning, and again, I will try to screen something if I have the time. Maybe I can actually try now. So it's the first scene. It's a very famous scene where so I'm going to. Can I press? Well, after all, press it between. No, because there is a generic. And I have this. What you playing? Work. Can we go through this? We have that
même une prairie avec des vols de corbeaux, des moissons et des feux d'herbe. Même une route où passent des voitures, des paysans, des couples, même un village pour vacances, avec une foire et un clocher peuvent conduire tout simplement à un camp de concentration. Le Struthof, Oranienburg, Auschwitz, Neuengamme, Belsen, Ravensbrück, Dachau furent des noms comme les autres sur les cartes et les guides. Le sang a caillé, les bouches se sont tues. Les blocs ne sont plus visités que par une caméra. Une drôle d'herbe a poussé et recouvert la terre usée par le piétinement des concentrationnaires. Le courant ne passe plus dans les fils électriques, plus aucun pas que le nôtre.
Voilà. So I think you have immediately a sense of everything I've said here. So I'm interested in the fact that the relation between the past and the present here is conveyed. I mean, this coexistence of the past with the present here is conveyed by a typical cinematographic technique, which is to bring in the field that which is out of the field. Right? So why does he do it? Well, precisely because the idea that we have a framing problem, and we must redefine the present by what surrounds it out of its own frame. So the present must be defined by a series, and the film proceeds like that, by a series of reframing, of embedded reframing, by which the identity of the present, that which we thought was just, peaceful landscape, becomes something else, a site of a concentration camp. So you have these reversals, which are constant, and which you also find in the film, in the relation between what is in the camp and what is out of the camp. So, for instance, when you are in the camps, says Carol in the text, the village out there seems to be just a mirage. Where you are in the village, the camp seems to be a mirage. So, two things which are not compossible, which cannot be possible together, are shown to be coexistent by the camera, by the tracking shot. So that's the way Resnais conveys a sense of this virtual dimension of time, basically. So past and present do not succeed to one another. They coexist together in a virtual dimension where there are possibilities of one another. So they are just like faces of the same thing. So of course it's very worrying. It's very worrying because it means that we must define ourselves by everything which has happened. We must not go beyond that and think that we are something else. We must redefine ourselves by everything which has happened. And the interesting fact for a philosopher is that it shows that the question of time, or the reconsideration of the problem of time, has to do, when you're trying to approach it with cinema, with a way you will produce a particular filmic space. And that I think is true in general, and that I think is something which Elie actually will talk about. So I'm going to leave it here, and we can come back to a series of problems later. Elie? That's it? I've been told to
Okay, that was quite brief. I was hoping you could elaborate on these very subtle points, but
you can ask the questions.
You left a few cues for me to kind of follow up on you. So I have a kind of a PowerPoint presentation with sound. Is it the right plug for sound? So yes, in comparison to what you've just heard, my presentation may sound a bit sketchy. The thing is, I want to do this job of extracting, in a rather abrupt way, the underlying metaphysical thesis that you just alluded to regarding the coexistence of the virtual and the actual, the past and the present, and do it in a way that is still in touch with the actual operations of cinema. And in order to do this, I will, on the one hand, review a few of the metaphysical underpinnings of Deleuze's own, own books on cinema, and of course themselves relying heavily, obviously, on Bergson's concepts of time and duration. And on the other hand, I would like to illustrate, but in a less focused way than Patrice, these views by a series of examples taken from, I hope, very diverse domains of cinema. So the first thing I want to submit you is this quote by Deleuze, which I think is very interesting and quite typical of his take on cinema, the way he views the relations between philosophy and cinema. I was a student of philosophy. It's extracted from an interview that came out, that was published when the first volume of his two cinema books came out. He says, I was a student of philosophy, and although I wasn't stupid enough to want to create a philosophy of cinema, one conjunction made an impression on me. I liked those authors who he's referring to philosophical authors, yes, who demanded that we introduce movement to thought, real movement. They denounced the Hegelian dialectic as abstract movement. How could I not discover the cinema which introduces real movement into the image? I wasn't trying to apply philosophy to cinema, but I went straight from philosophy to cinema. The reverse was also true. One went right from cinema to philosophy. So there are really three things which I think we should emphasize here before going on. It's first the idea that Deleuze doesn't think he was stupid enough, as he says, to produce a philosophy of cinema. The two volumes entitled Movement Image and Time Image are not books that you should categorize as philosophy of cinema. The way he operates on cinema is not by providing some kind of external reflection on that thing we call cinema, those things we call films. There's no need, in fact, if we pursue along this line of thought, there's no need for philosophy. I mean, cinema does not need philosophy, obviously, but philosophy is not even called for, it's not even required for cinema to make sense, to be understood. There's a lot of writings about cinema even before any philosopher got interested in cinema. There are very intelligent discourses on cinema, on the problems of cinema, on the essence of cinema. So basically, Deleuze's idea is not to say the truth about what cinema is. No philosophy of cinema. The first thing I wanted to stress. The second idea is, of course, and it's a consequence of the first, there's no need to apply philosophical ideas to cinema. It's rather as you Patrice said, it's rather the opposite move, which is interesting for Deleuze, how philosophy extracts something from cinema, rather than apply ready-made ideas or philosophers, as we say in French, pieces of ready-made philosophy. It's rather to extract concepts from cinema in order to do more philosophy, along different lines, probably. And finally, the idea that this operation of this encounter, this conjunction, the French word, I guess, is rencontre, conjunction. He says, une rencontre m'impressionnait. I was impressed by a certain encounter. The encounter between cinema and philosophy is one that doesn't need any kind of mediation. That's very important too. There's no need for a kind of overlay of theoretical, ideological discourse on cinema, about cinema, in order for philosophy to make something of cinema. There is a kind of direct short circuit, if you want, a court-circuit. the take, and actually when you read Deleuze's work, also he's very informed, and he obviously has read a lot, maybe even more than having seen many films. He has read a lot, many books, many articles on cinema, critical, theoretical, and so on. Despite this mass of information, it's very obvious that for Deleuze, philosophy doesn't need much mediation. There's a kind of direct take. And the way it works for Deleuze is, as Patrice mentioned, is that, well, philosophers start with their own problems and then kind of encounter problems which are of the same kind. We'll have to see what that can mean. In cinema, authors in cinema encounter problems which kind of resonate with problems that philosophers on their own have encountered and are trying to elaborate. So cinema is never a pretext for applying philosophy. It's really an extension of philosophy, or a way to do philosophy by other means. And the way it works is by extracting concepts. I've used this expression several times, extracting concepts. Concepts, as Deleuze regularly stresses, is proper to philosophy. It's the job of philosophers, he says, to construct, to produce concepts. And, basically, that's what defines, in a very operational way, philosophy. But if cinema does not produce concepts for its own sake, it produces ideas. There are ideas in cinema, des idées en cinéma, as Deleuze says in a rather odd way, des idées en cinéma, which kind of resonate with concepts, but which call for this work of extraction. There are ideas in cinema which express certain cinematographical problems, and the job of philosophy is to extract the concepts which adequately, which are apt to develop or unfold the problems which these ideas, these cinematographical ideas, express. What concepts, what problems, and what ideas, and also why. I mean, what's the end result? What's the benefit of extracting concepts in this strange encounter with cinema? So the general question, why should the philosopher pay attention to cinema? Because there are other domains, literature, science. There are many ways to actually do philosophy through other means. Why cinema? I would say that, in fact, cinema presents the same benefits as any other domain in that respect. For philosophy, the idea for philosophers, and especially philosophers like Deleuze or Bergson, in another way, the benefit of going through this detour is to gain precision, to reach a level of precision that philosophy by its own means can never reach. That was basically Bergson's principle, basic, I think, very profound principle. He said that philosophy needs precision, and in fact, in his view, this was the main reason why a philosopher should study science or art or the human sciences, social sciences, in order not so much in order to understand what's going on there, to provide a philosophy of these domains, but in order to attain a level of precision, level of refinement that concepts, sheer concepts by themselves, can never attain. So I would say the general answer to why philosophy and cinema, what can we expect from this encounter, is more precision. So I will try to now to give examples of the kind of problems, ideas, concepts that we can make more precise by assembling or by kind of reading philosophy and cinema. So I won't be developing that idea very much because it was already presented by Patrice. What Deleuze has in common with Bergson is that he's interested, for reasons that I don't have time to explain here, he's interested in extracting a notion of pure mobility, a notion of pure becoming out of the various forms, the various happenings that one can witness in one's experience. He's interested in this notion of mobility without mobiles, without things actually moving, sheer fact of mobility, the mere phenomenon of mobility. And what he sees in cinema is a direct expression of this possibility of not only thinking, but also experiencing in a very obvious, straightforward way, this pure mobility, which doesn't need to be attached to careers, mobiles, or things that are actually doing the moving. Sheer mobility. And of course, this notion of sheer mobility is best exemplified in a technical operation of cinema, which is the tracking shot. We had a nice example of the tracking shot, the opening shots of Nuit et Brouillard. We could illustrate the same principle of the tracking shot by this famous scene from Vertigo, Alfred Hitchcock's movie. There's actually a little more than tracking shots in this scene. I'm sorry for the kind of stroboscopic effect. It's entirely due to the weakness of my machine. It shouldn't be moving like this. Disturbing, right? The reason I'm showing this is that I'll have to come back to Vertigo for obvious reasons that have to do with relation between past and present, virtual and actual. So I thought I'd better show an example tracking shot from this movie. But there's something interesting that you should notice here, is that, and it is, I think, central to Hitchcock's construction, this inaugural scene where James Stewart is supposed to meet or even to see Madeleine, Kim Novak here, in this scene where you can clearly understand that there's no way he could have actually seen her face to face. Their eyes do not meet, their gaze do not cross. And this is a kind of metaphor for the whole movie. It's a movie about lines of actions which do not adjust, which are kept in a kind of disjunctive state, which never quite fit together. The importance of the tracking shot, as far as our question is concerned, as our problem is concerned, the problem of why philosophy should connect with cinema in order to extract concepts, in order to make its own problems more specific, more precise. This importance of the tracking shot, Deleuze explains, is due to the fact that in the tracking shot we have the example of a movement which is itself virtual. There's an actual continuous reframing, that's the principle of the tracking shot. There's a continuous reframing of the scene, of the field, and at the same time, in most of the tracking shots, there's no way you can clearly attach the movement, this movement of the camera, to any particular mobile, moving element in the scene. You could project the idea that this virtual movement, this camera move, is in fact a substitute for the subjective point of view of a particular character. Here it could be James Stewart, kind of gazing through the restaurant. But in the most general case, and even here in that scene, it is clear that there's no clear correspondence between any actually moving element in the scene and the virtual movement of the camera. So the tracking shot by itself exemplifies the idea of pure mobility. Mobility as an absolute quality that does not need any vehicle, any career. So the conclusion of Deleuze in his brilliant analysis of the tracking shot is that cinema does not simply put images into motion, but endows these images with a kind of self-motion, which is, if you wanted to define, characterize cinema in its essence, which is the essence of cinema. Cinema is all about endowing images with a kind of self-motion. Images as movement rather than images of movement. And of course, you know that the first volume of Deleuze's work on cinema is called l'image mouvement, movement image. The second is l'image temps, time image. The tracking shot and the long take are of course present in both volumes, but you can see how the very definition of the tracking shot led Deleuze inevitably to a kind of temporal characterization of the tracking shot rather than spatial. The tracking shot, and it is related to the idea of sheer mobility, is already virtually something that opens up to a purely temporal characterization of the basic operations of cinema. Not only is it an example of a sort of infra or supra-human point of view, a point of view which is beyond all views, but as a virtual movement of the camera itself, it suggests something that in fact exceeds all actual motion and presents itself, manifests itself as a movement through time. I'm really making it very short, putting it very briefly, but I think that the essence of the tracking shot being itself the basic operation of cinema, more important than framing, which it has in common with photography. The essence of the tracking shot is to extract sheer mobility and project the whole cinematographic experience into time. And now, of course, this suggests a problem. It's a problem that Deleuze encounters very soon in his books. And the problem is there a movement of the film itself, of the film as such? Does a film eventually reduce to a 2-hour tracking shot? I'm speaking metaphorically because there are very few films which actually work this way, although there are some experiments along those lines. Even Tchaikovsky uses very few takes, as you know, very long takes where time is kind of distended, diluted, dilated. But most of the times, well, editing comes into play and kind of conjoins the powers of the cut with the temporal expressive powers of the take. But still, there is this notion, this feeling that we could, on a certain level, if we abstract from the immediate perception and affects that relate to each scene, if we kind of take some distance and consider the experience of the film as a whole, there is a certain sense in which you would want to say that every film basically tends to this ideal of one single take, one long shot, which would kind of provide the virtual movement of the film itself, which would totalize every moment and provide the essence of cinematographical experience. And basically, if you generalize this problem, it comes down to the question: how does the film as a whole present itself as a single unified experience? And it's not an easy question when you think of it. I mean, it's the fact of sitting in front of a screen for 2, 3, even 4 hours doesn't make it a single experience by itself. I mean, it's a question we should ask. Does it make sense to step out of the theater after 1 hour? Or we've been yesterday to the Paula Cooper's gallery, where you can see the amazing video piece by Christian Marclay. It's called The Clock. It's a 24-hour video piece. You can see the whole film on Friday nights, I guess. It plays until Saturday mornings. We spent, 1 hour and a half? It was really a very fulfilling experience, but of course, we were kind of frustrated too, because obviously we haven't been through the whole experience. And I think it raises the question, what beyond the question of narrative closure, the question of getting to the end of the story, in terms of cinematographical experience, where does the unity of the film lie eventually? If we think of movies as experiences in their own right. Well, here I would like to emphasize the fact that in Deleuze's own analysis, the tracking shot, which was the starting point of my presentation, is in fact, well, seems to be a very unstable operation, because on the one hand, it's clearly what unifies the action or the meaning of a series of takes, but at the same time, it is also what unleashes the powers, I would say the disruptive powers, that are virtually contained in the total field space of the film. André Bazin, used to say that the tracking shot in that respect was the negation of framing. Framing provides a kind of totality, although it leaves things hors champ. We were having this discussion, what is the best translation of hors champ? Off field? Is it? Out of camera, yeah? Off camera, okay. But still, it gives you a sense of closure. But the tracking shot, being a continuous deframing of the image, is in fact centrifugal. It is a negation of framing, and it is what opens up the film, the entire film, to a multiplicity of actions that unfold simultaneously, and through which every tracking shot cuts. This is what a tracking shot does. It's not only reframing the image in real time, it's about cutting through a multiplicity of lines of action with their own durations and providing a sense of unity which is at the same time totally centrifugal. And I think this is a point which is central. It's a difficulty that Deleuze encounters, because there is a kind of instability or tension between, or polarity between two dimensions of cinema. On the one hand, the consistency, it's Deleuze's word, la consistance, the consistency brought about by the tracking shot and the notion of virtual movement, and at the same time, the disruptive tendency of any tracking shot to open up the cinematic experience to a multiplicity of diverging durations. And this is, of course, what is at stake in the most accomplished examples of this art. It's about providing a sense of unity within the most multifarious, the most disruptive, potentially disruptive experience of a multiplicity of durations. Basically, what I'm talking about here is, in fact, a problem that relates to space-time. And this is what I want to get at. I've mostly been framing the problem in terms of time, because I was following the thread suggested by Bergson, Deleuze's interpretation of Bergson. I have been following the thread of time, the temporal thread. But what I would like to get at, is actually an adequate characterization of the cinematic problem, the cinematic issue that for philosophy in terms of space-time, spatio-temporal experience. Space-time. Well, I won't be... Well, you all know that there's a very obvious way in which cinema is, in fact, actively constructing a new experience of space-time by merely stringing static images together, the way chronophotography had already done, but with the powers of this animating mechanism, which we at one time called the kinematographer. We know that this is in fact in itself a kind of modelization of space-time. And you may know that Bergson, who was not very fond of cinema either, although he went to the movies, but I don't think there is enough to write a whole book about the movies he's seen, because he never referred to them. Bergson used, as you may know, to say that, well, this kinematographic rendering of space-time, of spatio-temporal experience, is in fact an adequate model for the general illusions of intelligence, the way we cut things down to static images in order to animate them, relying on some kind of abstract power of animation, some kind of abstract movement, and eventually a homogeneous timeline, which would be the kind of serial scheme of things, the way things succeed each other chronologically. Well, this for him was the kind of spatio-temporal model that intelligence resorts to when it wants to come to terms with becoming. And for him it had, of course, as you know, a very negative ring to it, because the idea was that not only this illusion could be overcome, but it should be overcome in order for philosophy to actually solve its own problems. Well, what I would like to suggest now, and is relying on a few examples, providing a few examples, is that this notion of space-time could be re-evaluated in a more positive sense, and maybe in a sense which Deleuze, while sometimes defining things in terms of blocs d'espace-temps, space-time blocks, was kind of wary about. It's a direction of thought that kind of cuts across the Bergsonian privilege of time over space, and in a way would like to provide a positive version of the so-called spatialization of time, which Bergson denounced. And this can be understood in two ways, and it's really two very different kinds of examples that I would like to introduce. On the one hand, you could view the matter in an intensive way, stressing the word temporal in spatio-temporal, space-time. And the other way would be symmetrically to emphasize the spatial component, stress the space-time, in the word space-time, and it's a more extensive approach. On the one hand, and this is vertigo, which will be helpful here, you could kind of try and see how the construction of a time image, which is ultimately what every film is getting at, according to Deleuze. This is the virtual tendency of any film, is to reach some kind, the equivalent of a time image. It's not something that is reserved for certain films or a certain period of cinema. If you read Deleuze closely, there's no clear-cut opposition between one kind of cinema and the other. It's rather a question of tendencies, as always. So this is the first line of examples. Vertigo as the example of an intensive take on spatial-temporal experience. And on the other hand, I will rely on a very different example, which is the series 24, Jacques, for those who are familiar, which is a very nice example of the way cinema or television, but at this point the limits between the two are blurred, I think, and not very interesting, in fact, to elaborate upon. The way cinema or television actively produces a new kind of space-time in which the time image, the Deleuzian time image, develops according to new dimensions. It can be unfolded along new dimensions. So very quickly, and it's just another way of putting it, so I won't be too long on this. The problem of space-time is basically a problem of coexistence. The word was introduced by Patrice, the coexistence of the past and the present as a way to go beyond the merely chronological, serial, linear conception of time as a succession of moments, phases. Coexistence introduces the complementary the complementary idea of things actually unfolding through time by coexisting. And again, this can have two meanings. Coexistence can be thought of as the coexistence of past and present, the fact that the present does not succeed the past, but kind of carries the past along with it. Or it can be understood extensively, the coexistence of duration spread out in space. The question of how different lines of actions, lines of duration, can be part of a single whole, of a single experience. But the two aspects are really, I think, essential components of the cinematic experience. There are two problems that we have to solve as philosophers because they touch on the most, I would say, the most basic concepts that we need in order to understand the way things hang together in the most general sense of the term. I like a definition provided by an analytic philosopher called Wilfred Sellers. He used to say that philosophy is really, and I would say metaphysics is really about understanding how things, in the most general sense of the term, hang together in the most general sense of the term. Coexistence is one word that has been running through the history of philosophy. In Latin, sometimes read nexus, which is a nice way of putting it. Nexus is a word which has been running through the history of philosophy to capture this problem of how things hang together in space and time. Okay. Deleuze, in the same interview, says the following, and it's in a way sums up everything I've said so far. It seems obvious to me that the image is not in the present. What the image represents is in the present, but not the image itself. The image itself is an ensemble of time relations from the present, which merely flows, either as a common multiple or as the smallest divisor. Relations of time are never seen in ordinary perception, but they are seen in the image as long as it is a creative one. The image renders time relations, relations that can't be reduced to the present, sensible and visible. For example, an image shows a man walking along a river bank in a mountain region. In this image, there are at least three coexistence durations, three rhythms. The relation of time is the coexistence of durations in the image, which has nothing to do with the present, that is, what the image represents. The concept of the image in the present only applies to mediocre or commercial images. I think this kind of sums up the two books by Deleuze. Eventually, it's a very simple problem. It's about understanding that what is important about cinema is not the feeling of the present, what is presented to you, because the image, which is ultimately an essential component of cinema, is never present, never given in the present. It may represent things happening now, but this is really a pretext. What makes a film, what makes the movie that it is the way images are presented to you in a very odd way, in the sense that they're never actually or only present, but always presented to you at the same time as past or maybe as future to be. The image is a nexus of time relations, and the way Deleuze describes things using these very simple examples, which is an allusion to a famous Bergsonian example involving birds and a river, which is exactly the same problem. This very simple example shows that it is at the same time a question of space and of time. It's a question of space and time, because the problem ultimately is about the coexistence of durations, rhythms, not only in your conscious, but also in the world which the image represents, in the space which the film constructs. As you know, I've referred to this earlier, owing to Deleuze's own orientation, philosophical orientation, his Bergsonian origins, you might say, his analysis converges towards this notion of the time image, which is a modality, a regime of the cinematic image which captures, a sentence taken from Proust, a little time in its pure state, un peu de temps à l'état pur. So, there are many examples of this, but the most striking, those which are the purest example, in Deleuze's view, are examples of what he calls image cristal, crystal images. So why a crystal, and what are the criteria to identify crystal images? Well, there are no criteria. That's an interesting fact. There's no way you can actually point at an image in a film and say, oh, there it is. I have this image crystal which actually captures a little time in its pure state. As an image which would present itself as this sheer nexus of time or space-time relations without ever crystallizing or reducing to an actual state or an actual mental state given to the consciousness of the spectator. There's no way you can identify certain images as crystal images as opposed to other images which would not be crystallized or lacking something essential. You might say, having read Deleuze, that this is not really true because he gives examples. But the point is, his examples are very troubling. The thing you have to understand is that there's a scheme, a kind of a philosophical scheme behind his definition of the crystal image. It's explicit, I'm not guessing here. Deleuze is very explicit about the fact that the philosophical scheme of this concept of crystal images is taken from Bergson's Le Souvenir du Présent. It's an article reproduced in Mind Energy, volume L'énergie spirituelle, translated as Mind Energy, in which Bergson describes the pathological cases of paramnesia, the feeling of deja vu, which sometimes can become very intrusive and quite pathological, with certain persons having kind of constant feeling of deja vu, which estranges them radically from experience, from their relation with the world. How does it work? Well, I'm not going to explain what is at stake in Bergson, but the essential point here is that in the feeling of deja vu, the way Bergson interprets it, you have a kind of superimpression or overlay of the present, the actual present, the image you get by simply perceiving things, and the memory of this present, not the memory that would be brought back by this perception, a memory from something that happened to you in the past. No, the memory of this present that you're actually experiencing, which is kind of given simultaneously with the actual perception. So the interpretation of the souvenir du présent, the déjà vu, the paramnesia, according to Bergson, is the right interpretation is to understand that here we have an instance of the coexistence of the present, of the actual perception, and the immediate memory of this perception. So that the perception is actually presents itself in this kind of spectral, eerie dimension of being at once the present that it is and the past that it already is. So the past is an instance where the past, and it's very, of course, elusive, but in most cases, but it's an instance of the past coexisting in a very literal way with the present. The past here is simply a dimension of the present experience. It's not something that happened to you before. It's what's happening now in the dimension of the past, because the past is not, again, it's not a dimension that, it's not an archive of whatever happened. It's not the accumulation of past present. The past is actively present as a coexistent dimension of experience, which relates to what Patrice said in on more metaphysical level. So what does Deleuze extract from this? It's a double operation of extraction. He has to extract something from Bergson on the one hand and extract something from cinema on the other. From Bergson he extracts the mere idea of the coexistence or a superimpression of the virtual past and the virtual memory of the present and the actual perception of the present. It's the coexistence of virtual and actual, past and present, memory and perception. But they are given in a state of coalescence or fusion. And this is what he needs, what Deleuze needs to understand a fundamental operation of cinema, the fact that the virtual movement of the camera, the image as a movement through time, given as a movement through time, in fact constantly aims at providing this kind of experience. Although it doesn't always reach that goal, it always aims at providing an experience where the actual and the virtual are sort of fused together and given in one single experience. The present being at once something that you can understand as, you know, in the perspective of the past, or the present being also in itself the reminiscence of something that has not yet happened. So the examples, because that was my starting point. How can we identify such moments, such crystal images? You understand the metaphor of the crystal. I didn't stress that, but the metaphor, because it's a metaphor of the crystal, comes from the fact that a crystal actually presents itself as a very translucent piece of matter, which kind of which displays a virtual image in certain circumstances. If the light is right, presents a virtual image, an instance of what is sometimes referred to as total refraction, a virtual image that seems to be floating in the middle of the crystal, and which is kind of contemporary with the actual reflection of the environment on its different sides. The image in Deleuze's, the way Deleuze is using it, is reduces to the notion of a two-faced, two-sided image. One side is in the virtual, the other side is in the actual. One side is actually perceived, the other is given in the element of pure past, pure memory. This is what is crystal-like about the image. The examples he gives, because he gives examples, are very I would say, disturbing, unsettling. He refers in many places to this famous scene from Orson Welles' The Lady of Shanghai.
In here, that's likely.
It's a scene which involves mirrors.
Why don't you try to understand? George was supposed to take care of Arthur, but he lost his silly head and shot Broom. After that, I knew I couldn't trust him. He was mad. He had to be shot.
And what about me?
Oh, we could have gone off together.
Into the sunrise. You and me, or you and Crispy.
I love you.
One who follows his nature keeps his original nature in the end. But haven't you heard ever of something better to follow?
No.
I knew I'd find you two together. If I hadn't, Elsa, I might have gone on and played it your way. You didn't know that, but you did plan for me to follow you.
Drinking.
I presume you think that if you murder me here, your sailor friend will get the blame and you'll be free to spend my money. Well, dear, you aren't the only one who wants me to die. Our good friend, the district attorney, is just itching to open a letter that I left with him.
I'll stop here. Then there's some acts of breaking glass and shattered mirrors. And the only point I want to stress here is that it seems to me that the reason why Deleuze uses this example or refers to this film, the main reason is that mirrors are obviously involved, and that there is a very clear visual instance of a laminated field of view. I mean, this way the image is framed is and multiply reframed by all these mirrors seems to give a literal equivalent of the crystal image, but it may be too literal. Are any scenes of this kind crystal images? Is it enough to have mirror reflections and this kind of Manierist effects to have a crystal image? Probably not. And as a matter of fact, Deleuze does not really elaborate on this example. Quotes it repeatedly, but never makes something really interesting of it, I think. Alain is another of his examples. here again you have mirrors and long takes and several operations which I do not want to enumerate, which kind of suggest the stratified nature of the space-time of this film by Resnais. This is what Deleuze has to say. Resnais is certainly one of the authors for whom the image is least in the present, because the image Resnais films depends. Interesting. The jump cut here. Resnais' film depends entirely on the coexistence of heterogeneous directions. Okay, let's assume this is a complete statement. And finally, another example that I found in Deleuze. This is of course a mistake. It's not Vertigo, but Late Spring by Ozu. This is a copy-paste problem. This, according to Deleuze, may be the first, historically, the first time image, the first pure time image. He says this can be debated, but it's definitely also an image that comes comes repeatedly when he refers to the crystal image. This woman laying beside her father, who is going to remarry. I'm not going through the plot. It's important because it's also a matter of collecting memories from the mother, who's not there anymore, and the nostalgia that comes with it. But what is important is this scene, which Deleuze describes as Ozu's still life. Still life is an instance of crystal image. And why is that? Why is that? Well, Deleuze never says why. He never says why. There is a screen, there's display of shadows, and the kind of floating quality of the image. But again, why is this image, this particular image, particularly exemplifying the coalescence or fusion of the virtual and the actual? In what sense is this image not given in the present, as in mediocre or commercial films? It's not very clear, it's not obvious. And the only way, if I follow Rancière, to actually provide criteria for rigorous application of the concept is to rely on the plot, on the fable, on the narrative structure of the film. It's because this film is about memory, partly about memory, and that we know things about the characters involved in this particular scene, that we can interpret this image as one instance of crystal image. So my suggestion is this: at this point, if we don't want to overdo the examples of Deleuze, or to enter in some kind of a game which consists in interpreting the very films, the very example provided by Deleuze along Deleuzian lines, which is not very interesting, I guess. I think we should come up with new examples where the crystal quality, the crystalline quality of the image is not very obvious, and where we kind of find immanent criterion for applying the concept. By immanent criterion, I mean criterion which not solely rely on the fable, on the narrative structure, on the psychological patterns which we tend to identify with the characters, immanent elements which have to do, on the contrary, with the space-time structure of the film itself. And here I come back to Vertigo, simply to say that the whole film is structured, and I think if we reflect back on the examples I've just given, this is the way we should approach the problem of the time image, not by analyzing a single take or a single scene, but by understanding the structure of the whole film. This brings us back to the problem of the unity of the film experience. The whole film, Vertigo, is about the overlay or super impression of this woman and this woman, Madeleine and Jody. Same actress, Kim Novak, embodying two very different characters that are absolutely the opposite in every regard, And of course, this is very troubling. It's an instance of, you might say, of deja vu for James Stewart, at least, and for the spectator, certainly. Because what happens at the last third of the film, not really the last half, the last third of the movie, is that the first character, Madeleine, which was already a fiction, because it was obviously a role played by this woman. Well, this is at least what we get from the narrative. This woman who replaces that woman is utterly unbelievable. In James Stewart's eye, she is a fraud. And at the same time, she is kind of the living testimony of the fact that this woman has never died, so to speak. It's a very complex plot and a rather entangled experience for the spectator himself, because looking at this woman, he cannot stop thinking about the other woman, kind of sees her traits behind the kind of appalling makeup and pistachio colors and so on. And it's an instance of cinematic deja vu, which is really sustained until the end of the film. It's very, when you think of it, it's quite rare to have this kind of feeling that this woman here, which we know is the real one, cannot be believed as a character, even as a movie character. She's utterly unbelievable, and this is what the film is about. In this scene, very famous scene where James Stewart asks Judy, the second woman, to dress up like Madeleine and to kind of embody her plastic qualities. What happens is very interesting, because we have, in a way, we're going to do something very reprehensible. I'm going to fast forward the scene so you can get a sense of what happens when she comes out of the bathroom. He just asked her to put her hair right, just as Madeleine had a chignon, what's the name? Sorry? The bun. She had a bun. And the bun was the missing element. He asked her to fix that. And when she's done, this is what you get. Which I guess could qualify as a crystal image in the most obvious literal sense. This kind of resurrection of Madeleine in the body of Judy, and the erratic quality of the image, of course, speaks for itself. She's a crystal. She's crystal incarnate. And of course, she's also a phantom, and she's a ghost, if you prefer. She's all that at the same time. But my point is that, of course, it would be a rather trivial way of identifying the crystal image, of applying the Deleuzean concept to a movie, to simply I'm sorry, I have to stop. To simply identify the plastic quality of the image. See, the play with colors and filters and so on. There must be something else, something deeper going on. And in order to understand this is something I have been explaining quite extensively in my book. You have to understand that space is involved. The space, not only the narrative structure, but the actual space-time of the movie itself is involved in the process of identifying crystal images. So there are cues like jump cuts, even when Madeleine herself is presented. These are two images taken from the scene we've seen a few minutes ago, the scene in the Ernie's restaurant. There's a very strange jump cut where this image is succeeded by this one. Well, it's not very clear, but there's clearly a difference in the lighting, in the overall expression, maybe even in the makeup, I don't know. This kind of substitutions, subtle jump cuts, are of course cues that enable the spectator to understand that there's something going on, which has to do with the way things connect in this very eerie spatial-temporal frame of San Francisco, as you've never seen it before. The conclusion I've reached by simply reflecting on the opening scene, the credit scene, and the very nice graphic animation by Saul Bass, is that the overall structure, I mean here spatial structure, of the movie is akin to a Mobius strip, that is a non-orientable space, a one-sided surface which has the property of inverting the elements that cross the space. If you slide along one of the sides, in fact there's only one side, if you slide along the one side of this twisted cylinder or a twisted strip, you'll end up reversed. You cannot really try it yourself, but by using, for example, an L and sliding it, you'll see why it will come back inverted. So I think the overall structure of the space-time is that of a non-orientable space, that the non-chronological time, which relates to what I've been saying about the déjà vu, cannot be fully understood if you don't take into account the non-orientable quality of the space itself. And of course, you could also understand this by merely observing this very strange curves that are James Stewart is tracing in San Francisco by chasing this woman. This kind of vortex quality, but which ultimately leads to the conclusion that there's no way you can orient yourself in this space. Anyway, my point is that you cannot rely merely on images, even on takes, in order to identify the spatial-temporal structure of film and the nature of the crystal image. The crystal image is, as Deleuze himself says, is a germ. It's a differential element which is already present in any image. This relates to the idea that the time image is not a particular kind of image, it's not a category, it's a tendency which runs through the whole history of cinema and which is already virtually present in every movement image. But the upshot is that there's no way you can pinpoint a particular image and say, there you go, there it is. I could say, this is a crystal image because there's this kind of vortex which suggests something that is akin to the vortex of time, and the thing is that if you do that, eventually you end up playing with metaphors. So, for example, I think something that is more telling, more interesting, is to reflect on the reverse dolly shots, the tracking, very interesting tracking shot which combines the ordinary tracking shot, the camera that is being tracked, and the optical, what is sometimes called the optical zooming, the optical tracking shot, the zooming. So you zoom, and at the same time you have virtual movement, virtual camera movement, and you have this feeling of space kind of distorting itself, which is a nice illustration, nice exemplification of the spatial-temporal, ultimately spatial-temporal issue. And yes, well, I won't really develop this example which I had in mind, which is an example of the second orientation, which I think would be required in order to be totally fair, which is to take into account the other problem, which is the other issue of the coexistence of duration in space, not the coexistence of several layers of time within a single duration, whether the duration of a particular scene or the duration of the film itself or the duration, the subjective duration of the spectator's consciousness, but the actual distribution of several durations or lines of actions, if you want, in a single scene or in a single movie. There's genre, a cinematic genre, which has sometimes been called urban symphony, or the cross-section films, which is illustrated by work like Walter Hussmann's Symphony einer Großstadt on Berlin, or you could even think of Ziga versus The Man with the Camera. The example, the most recent example in my view, relying also on multi-screen scenes like this one, is is 24, this series. I would like to say only one thing, is that of course this is a typical action movie. It's probably an instance of the mediocre commercial films that Deleuze had in mind, in a sense. But in another sense, it's a very remarkable illustration of how a genre which is entirely devoted to providing affects such as the cliffhanger effect, very intense suspense sustained for hours, literally 24 hours, how a genre which is so clearly devoted to the most sensory motor quality of cinema, to use Deleuze's expression, how a movie of this genre, or a series of this genre, can actually produce a space-time experience of a totally, I think, I would even say unequal, unequal type, which is the experience of a single whole, of a world highly connected, most notably by devices which help the protagonist to communicate at a distance using GPS, cell phones, and all kinds of tracking devices, but which at the same time is totally disruptive. The way it unfolds is really parallel lines of actions, parallel durations, or local times which crisscross, which get synchronized, but which provide an very unsettling experience of a totality which is constantly fragmenting itself, sort of imploded world, an imploded whole. The catastrophe has already taken place, as you know. It's really the post-September 11th movie. The catastrophe has already taken place, the world is fragmented, and what you get is a kind of splintered or laminated space-time with things hang together quite loosely, disconnected and reconnecting themselves in real time. But of course the whole point of the series, as explained in chapter of my book, For Accord, a real time which in fact is a total fiction, and which doesn't work as we think it should, because there is no action at a distance, despite all the nice technologies we have to synchronize durations. The principle of the series is one of active disruption of durations, or disconnection, that's nevertheless kind of hang together in a fractal multiverse, a blinking, fragmented world, which is probably a nice metaphor for the world we live in. I thank you for your time and attention.
Okay, so we have a few minutes for questions. So would anyone like to start? So maybe I can ask you if you would come back to the question of plot and of narration, because you mentioned in both your examples and both your talks, the point was to extract something that wasn't necessarily recuperated by plot, right? That not to make narrative the most significant part of the film, and certainly not to make the unity, what hangs, the way it hangs together. And yet can one do away entirely with narrative, and can one do away entirely with the fable? Or so, I mean, in a way, for me, part of the strength of Jacques Rancière's argument is that it's precisely in these moments of tension between plot and crystals of time or pure aesthetics that something happens. And so, do you see that, or do you both go more towards Deleuze, who it seems to me in his chronology is really trying to get away from the movement image, from plot, and to locate in modern cinema or post-war cinema something that's non-narrative, something that's not.
Okay. Well, thank you. Maybe the problem is not to oppose the narrative cinema and non-narrative cinema. And as a matter of fact, as far as Deleuze is concerned, he only takes example. I mean, he's not interested in experimental cinema, and he has even very violent against experimental cinema, which I would share, let's say. But so he's in fact the problem is not, because if it's true that if you only rely on the plot, if you only take from the film the narrative aspect, and actually that is the same for history. How can you use the cinematic medium itself? Of course, you can tell stories with films, but this is not where you will probably find the specificity and therefore the interest. So now, what Rancière says is slightly more delicate, because he says that it basically opposes to the distinction between classical cinema and modern cinema that Deleuze approaches it on. And that goes with the time movement and the time image. And so what he wants to say that we have never been modern, because there's nothing like the time image. So what he wants to say that it's a kind of counter movement within the movement, which will and that I'm not sure is true, really, because it's again in the case of if you take from the Night and Fog, I mean, of course there is a story, but what would that mean to say? Well, let's take the Rancière's examples, for instance, because he is very interested in Fritz Lang's embryo motif, what's the title in English? And he's interested in these moments in which the image is not functional anymore in the plot, right? So it's M is looking at a window shop, and there are toys, and there is a little girl next to him, and there are quotes in the population. So it's a free movement. So he is the one who's interested in these movements, which in some way escape the plot. But it's not the only moments which are temporal in a film. You can have movements which are functional in the narrative, but nonetheless will produce a very strong sense of time, which is different from following the different stages of the story. So that's the case, for instance, in Night and Fog. They have, indeed, it's about an event. Yeah, it's about an event. But the problem is not whether it's about an event or not, but how you relate to the event. And to relate to it in a narrative way would mean, but that's a definition, maybe that's not true, but would mean simply to go through the different stages of the action, one after the other. So what Deleuze says would be, well, there is another way of relating to the event, which would precisely disrupt the temporal succession of the stages, and which would capture the unity of that. So I think in this story, it's not. It's Rancière really who has a kind of non-narrative interest in cinematic images, whereas Deleuze is interested in events. That's really what he's interested in. And the question is whether, of course, I mean, we probably, and that would be an interesting discussion to have. I mean, we can probably say that this definition of narration, as going from one stage to another in an ordered succession, that may be the wrong definition of narration. Maybe that could be, but that would be, I think, the only true criticism or powerful criticism. What do you think?
I totally agree. I will only add this, that the very fact that Deleuze cannot pinpoint crystalline image without implicitly or explicitly relying on the plot, Rancière sees that the contradiction, some kind